Hello, my name is Finn and I am a coordinator at the Department of Human Research at Northeastern University. This 5-minute primer video will cover the top 5 study items or aspects that push CPS studies out of exempt review status. This video will be focused on what is most common for the College of Professional Studies and may also be interesting for other departments doing social behavioral research. So before I get into it, here is a brief overview of the top 5 CPS study components I will be discussing. So the first study component I'll be getting into is accessing and analyzing secondary data as part of meeting the research aims. Given the exempt criteria covering the use of secondary data, unless this data is entirely publicly accessible or collected in a way in which no identifiers are in the dataset, the use of secondary data is often outside the scope of exempt review. To give some examples, the IRB sees this in CPS studies when the dataset needs to be requested in some way in order to be accessed, which is common for data such as student records, internal company records, and so on. Or the study team describes in their protocol that they will have access to a code key, making the data identifiable, or that they plan to do additional study activities such as interviews, surveys, or focus groups with whom the secondary data is about. It is important to note here that even if the study team is not using the secondary data set to identify participants for their additional study activities, it still counts as attempting to recontact the subjects in the secondary data set if the two populations overlap. For example, if a study wanted to access student reports and then separately recruit students for interviews, even if the reports can't identify the students, it is still the same group of people they are attempting to recontact. Next, we have secondary data use, but for the sole purpose of recruitment. So this would be, for example, accessing school records or some other secondary data set in order to identify those who you want to send recruitment materials to. This applies if you are accessing data beyond just contact information. The main issue here is that unless the data is publicly accessible, there really isn't a pathway for a study using secondary data to recruit to stay exempt, as by the nature for recruitment, you would need identifiers to be in the dataset in order to contact those individuals. So for example, if the dataset you want to use to recruit needs to be requested or accessed in a way that you need special credentials or assistance from a particular person, it would push your study out of exemption. Another common study component we see in CPS is studies collecting information that is critical of a workplace or people in the workplace, such as supervisors, clients, or coworkers. Collecting data critical of workplaces can often clash with the exempt criteria covering identifiable data collection, as often this data has the potential to harm professional relationships, professional reputations, or even affect current and future employment opportunities. Some examples of the kind of data I am referring to is asking participants about how supervisors fail to meet expectations or provide support, asking about racism in the workplace, probing for negative feelings or statements on coworkers, supervisors, or clients, and asking how participants may fail to meet work expectations or violate company policies. Along a similar vein, another common issue we see in CPS studies is asking participants to divulge information on sensitive health conditions or symptoms. What I am referring to here is beyond just asking a participant what they know about a condition, but rather their personal experiences with them. This would include asking participants about specific mental or physical health symptoms, such as symptoms of depression, anxiety disorders, certain disabilities, etc. And this is also distinct from asking about general health, mood, or well-being, as I am referring to probing for specific clinical symptoms. An important example to bring up here would be asking about past or current drug use. This data can often push a study outside of the exemption scope, as it can possibly harm reputations, relationships, affect current and future opportunities, or even probe for data that can have legal or civil consequences for the participant. Now, the last component I'm going to talk about revolves around behavioral interventions that do not meet the exempt criteria. In CPS, one of the most common issues is when the behavioral intervention is not considered brief, meaning it lasts over 5 total sessions. Each session may be longer than 2 hours, or the total time across sessions is longer than 10 hours or requires more than 4 months to complete. In addition, the content of the intervention may also cause a study to no longer be exempt if it crosses the line of being considered offensive or embarrassing to the subjects. Now, this one can be very specific to a study, as what is considered to be offensive or embarrassing is often dependent on the population you are working with. But the DHR advises that any controversial topics may cross this line, including some topics concerning politics, race relations, gender relations and inequality, and other such subjects. To provide some specific examples, interventions involving materials on racism, critical race theory, or social justice can often be considered offensive, and interventions involving materials containing explicit content, violent content, or illegal behaviors are definitely considered to fall outside the scope of exempt review. And that concludes the top 5 study components in CPS that can bring a study out of exempt review. It's important to remember that exempt review is a narrow scope, and study teams should review our guidance on the exemption categories and think critically on how their planned study may or may not fall under an exempt category. I also want to point out that if you are designing a study and find that it does not fit into the exemption categories, that is okay. You are in no way expected to change a study for the sole purpose of keeping it exempt. Submitting a non-exempt application is completely feasible, just a different review standard. And that's it for this video. If you have any questions or need further guidance, please reach out to the IRB office at irbreview@northeastern.edu or come visit us during our drop-in hours. Thanks for watching.